Hi, I'm Vera. The day of my father's funeral, my stepmother cornered me in his study, holding a pen that was already uncapped. She said, "Let's get this done. Sign it all over. The business, the house. You don't need these burdens now." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even flinch. I just looked at the lawyer she brought with her and realized they must have planned this while he was still breathing. They didn't know I'd been quiet for a reason. They didn't know my father had left me far more than assets. And they had no idea what my silence was about to cost them. Before we get started, I'm curious what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. The house still smelled like gardenias and old books. My father's signature scent, Eleanor, my stepmother, and stood with her arms crossed. Her grief, a perfectly tailored black dress. Her son, Julian, my stepbrother, leaned against the mahogany desk like he already owned it. The air was thick with the cloying sweetness of funeral flowers and unspoken greed. I hadn't cried yet. The shock was a cold, hard shell around my heart, lying in the top drawer of that very desk. Beneath a stack of old letterhead was the sealed envelope my father had given me a month before he passed. The company he'd built from a garage startup into a quiet powerhouse in logistics software, it was mine. All of it. He'd made the transfer 6 months ago. Cleanly and quietly. He died last Tuesday. After a fight, he knew he couldn't win. I remember sitting by his bed, the machines beeping a steady grim rhythm. He gripped my hand. If his voice, a dry whisper, "Don't show your cards, Vera, until you see what game they're playing." That was the last piece of advice he ever gave me. And I listened. I've always been better at listening than talking. No one. Not Eleanor. Not Julian. I knew he'd already signed over his controlling interest. They believed it was all tangled up in the estate. A prize to be claimed. They thought the company was a small, struggling local firm. That's the story my father let people believe after a hostile buyout attempt years ago. He went private, went quiet, and then he grew it into an empire in the shadows. And now, that empire was mine. Outside the study window, the gray Boston sky threatened rain. I needed a moment. It was supposed to be a day of mourning, of remembering the man who taught me how to read a balance sheet and how to ride a bike. I expected quiet reflection, maybe a glass of whiskey in his honor. Not this. This ambush. Eleanor cleared her throat. Her patience. Wearing thin. "Vera, darling, we don't have all day. The lawyer has another appointment." She called me darling, but the word was a shard of glass. I looked at the man beside her. He wasn't the family lawyer. I didn't recognize him at all. On the desk, between a photo of my father and me at my college graduation and a half-empty coffee cup, was a leather-bound folder. The lawyer slid it toward me. "It's just a formality," Eleanor said, her voice smooth as silk. "To consolidate the family assets. Makes everything cleaner for the transition." I didn't move. Something inside me went still and cold. The kind of chill that settles deep in your bones. I slowly reached for the folder. The title on the first page read, "Irrevocable Transfer of Assets and Controlling Interest." My fingers traced the words. The language was dense with legalese, but the intent was crystal clear. "This looks comprehensive," I said softly. Turning a page. "I'm sure my attorney will want to review it first." Eleanor's smile didn't falter, but her eyes tightened just for a second. It was a flicker of pure irritation. If I hadn't spent the last 10 years watching her, I would have missed it. Of course, she said, her voice still dripping with false sympathy. But it's really just a family matter. No need to get outsiders involved. I nodded politely and closed the folder. Sliding it back across the desk, I'd grown up being the quiet one in this new, blended family, the one who read books in her room, who didn't cause drama, who didn't take up space. But that never meant I wasn't paying attention, noting the inconsistencies, filing away the cracks in their carefully constructed masks. And in that moment, I knew exactly how they saw me. A grieving little girl, overwhelmed and ready to be managed. Not a threat. Not a player. Perfect. The next morning, I woke to an email that felt like a slap in the face. It was a notification from the bank. A transfer of $50,000 had been made from a joint account my father held with Eleanor. The memo line read simply, "Funeral expenses." I stared at the number. The funeral was prepaid. My father had taken care of every last detail years ago. A fact. I knew Eleanor was well aware of $50,000. I didn't recognize the name of the recipient company. E.J. Holdings. I called her immediately. She answered on the third ring, her voice groggy with feigned sleep. "Vera, is everything all right? I just saw a bank transfer." I said, keeping my voice level, for $50,000 to a company called E.J. Holdings. There was a pause. "Oh, that," she said, her voice suddenly crisp and businesslike. "Initial bereavement costs, catering, hosting out-of-town relatives, legal consultations. It adds up. You'll see. We had a caterer. The relatives stayed at a hotel I paid for. And I haven't consulted any lawyers." I said. She let out a long, weary sigh. The kind she used when she was pretending I was being difficult. "Vera, you're distraught. You can't be expected to handle these things. Julian and I are taking care of it. Don't you trust us?" Trust. The word hung in the air between us. Hollow and absurd. I ended the call. I spent the next hour online. Digging. It didn't take long to find it. E.J. Holdings LLC. Formed 3 months ago. Registered agent Eleanor Vance. Co-signer Julian Vance. E.J. Eleanor and Julian. The business address was a P.O. box in the next town over. The listed purpose of the company was estate management and asset consolidation. Not grief counseling. Not event planning. Consolidation. My blood ran cold. They hadn't just planned this. They had incorporated it. That evening, I did something I should have done the moment my father got sick. I drove to a nondescript office building downtown. A place with a quiet co-working space I'd rented under my own name months ago. I needed a secure connection. I logged into the real company portal. The one Eleanor and Julian knew nothing about. The dashboard lit up my screen. Quarterly profits were up 12%. A new patent had just been approved. A major European distribution deal was pending. Then, I opened a separate, encrypted file server my father had set up. It was a complete digital archive. Scanned documents, emails, private financial statements. He'd saved everything. I started searching for E.J. Holdings, and that's when I found it. It wasn't just a new LLC. Eleanor had used a digital signature program to approve a $100,000 line of credit for E.J. Holdings. using my father's company as collateral. The request was dated the day he was moved into hospice care. This wasn't just greed. This was fraud. I sat back in my chair, the city lights twinkling below. The grief I'd been holding back finally hit me, but it was quickly followed by a wave of cold, hard rage. They thought they were dismantling his legacy. They had no idea. They were just handing me the ammunition I needed to protect it. I didn't react immediately. I let them think they were winning. The next week was a masterclass in passive aggression. The gardener was let go, an unnecessary expense. Julian announced over dinner. The weekly grocery delivery was canceled. We need to be more frugal now, Eleanor said, placing a single, sad-looking casserole on the table. They were isolating me, trying to create a world where I was completely dependent on them. A world where signing that folder would feel like a relief. The real escalation came on a Tuesday. I was in my father's study, sorting through his personal papers. When the doorbell rang, it was a man in a crisp suit carrying a briefcase. "Vera?" he asked. "I'm Dr. Alistair Finch. Your stepmother asked me to stop by. She's concerned about you." I stared at him blankly. "Concerned about what?" "Your emotional state," he said, stepping into the foyer uninvited. "Grief can be overwhelming. Eleanor feels you might not be capable of making sound financial decisions right now. She suggested a temporary conservatorship, just until you're feeling more yourself." A conservatorship. They weren't just trying to take the company anymore. They were trying to take my life, my autonomy. He opened his briefcase, and inside, I saw the familiar letterhead of the lawyer Eleanor had brought to the study. This was their next move. To have me declared mentally incompetent? "I'm fine," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Of course, Doctor," Finch said with a practiced, soothing tone. "But perhaps it's best if a professional makes that determination. We can just have a little chat." I looked past him. Through the open doorway, Julian was standing by the car in the driveway, watching, waiting. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just an idea they'd had. This was a coordinated attack. They wanted to strip me of my rights so they could plunder the estate without any resistance. That was the last straw. The grief and the anger in my chest finally hardened into something else. Pure, unadulterated resolve. I smiled at the doctor. A thin, cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You know what? You're right. We should talk, but not here. Let's go to my office. My entire team is there. They can attest to my state of mind." His professional calm wavered for a second. "Your office?" "Yes," I said, grabbing my keys from the hook by the door. "I'm the CEO of my father's company. Have been for 6 months. I'm sure my board of directors would be fascinated to hear your assessment." I walked right past him, leaving him standing in the foyer with his mouth slightly open. Julian's face. When he saw me walking toward my car with a look of absolute determination, was a picture of dawning horror. The game had changed, and they were about to find out they weren't just playing against me. They were playing against my father. And he had planned for everything. I didn't go to the real office. Not yet. I drove straight to the law offices of Goodwin and Finch, my father's real attorneys. Mr. Goodwin was in his late 60s, with eyes that had seen everything. He'd been my father's friend and counsel for 40 years. He stood up. The moment I walked in, "Vera," he said, his voice grave. "I was hoping I wouldn't see you this soon. But given the circumstances, I'm not surprised." He already knew. My father had prepared him. I spent the next 2 hours laying everything out Eleanor's demand. The $50,000 transfer. The fraudulent line of credit. The ambush with the psychiatrist. I showed him the documents I'd found on the server. He listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Your father called this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He called it the vulture clause of." He swiveled his chair around and opened a large, fireproof safe behind him. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. It was identical to the one Eleanor's lawyer had. "This, Mr. Goodwin said, placing it on the desk between us, is your father's true last will and testament. The one he filed with the courts is a placeholder, adekoi. This one contains the real instructions." He opened it. Inside, the first page was a letter addressed to me in my father's familiar, sharp handwriting. It began times, "My dearest Vera, if you are reading this, it means the vultures have landed. Do not be afraid. Be strategic. I have laid a trail of breadcrumbs for you. And a series of traps for them." The will was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering. It detailed the quiet transfer of the company to me 6 months prior, making it a pre-existing asset, completely separate from the estate and untouchable by Eleanor. But that was just the beginning. The real weapon was the vulture clause. It stipulated that any beneficiary who engaged in fraudulent activity, attempted to seize control of assets through manipulation, or made a legal challenge to my authority as heir would be immediately and irrevocably disinherited. Their share of the estate, which had been a generous 25% for Eleanor, would be forfeited and donated to a charity of my choosing. Their greed, Mr. Goodwin said, a grim satisfaction in his voice, is the trigger for their own undoing. Every move they've made against you has been a step toward their own financial ruin. He then pointed to the documentation for the fraudulent $100,000 line of credit. And this, he said, is not just a breach of the will. This is bank fraud. A felony. We have them. Vera, we have them cold. A sense of profound, chilling clarity washed over me. This was no longer a family drama. This was a war my father had prepared me to win. The climax wasn't a shouting match. It was a board meeting. Eleanor and Julian had called an emergency meeting with the company's CFO, a man they thought they had on their side. They walked into the main conference room at the office, radiating smug confidence. They were there to officially declare me incompetent and install Julian as the interim head of the company. They saw me sitting at the head of the long table and smiled condescendingly. "Vera, darling," Eleanor began, "we're so glad you could make it. This will be much easier if you cooperate." Julian slid a folder across the table. "This is the power of attorney paperwork. Dr. Finch has already provided his preliminary assessment. It's for the best." I didn't even look at it. I just nodded to the door. "You're right. We do have another guest." The door opened, and Mr. Goodwin walked in, followed by 2 uniformed police officers. Eleanor's face went white. Julian shot to his feet. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, our voice shaking. "This, Mr. Goodwin said, his voice echoing in the silent room, "is a board meeting you were not invited to because as of 9 o'clock this morning, you are no longer a beneficiary of the Vance estate." He laid a certified copy of the real will on the table. He explained the vulture clause. detailing how their every action, from the fraudulent LLC to the attempt to have me declared incompetent, had triggered their own disinheritance. But that's not possible. Julian stammered. The will you saw was a decoy. I said, my voice steady and clear for the first time in weeks. My father knew you. He knew exactly what you would do. Then Mr. Goodwin placed a second file on the table. It was the evidence of the $100,000 fraudulent line of credit. One of the officers stepped forward. Eleanor and Julian Vance. He said, his voice flat and official. You are under arrest for suspicion of bank fraud and identity theft. The clicking of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Eleanor didn't scream or cry. She just stared at me. Her face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. In her eyes, I finally saw the truth. She had never seen me as a daughter. She had only ever seen me as an obstacle. As they were let out, the CFO, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally looked at me, a newfound respect in his eyes. The power in the room hadn't just shifted. It had finally settled where it belonged. The consequences were swift and total, faced with irrefutable evidence. Eleanor and Julian both took plea deals to avoid a longer sentence. They got 3 years probation and were ordered to pay full restitution, which wiped out every penny they had. They lost the house, the cars, everything. The social circle that once adored them vanished overnight. Their carefully constructed world, built on my father's money, crumbled into dust. My world, however, became quiet. It became mine. I formally took my seat as CEO, and my first act was to establish a charitable foundation in my father's name. Funded by the 25% of the estate Eleanor had forfeited, it provides grants to small, family-run businesses, the kind of company my father started out with. One afternoon, months later, I was going through an old box of my father's things from the study and found a small, worn leather journal. On the last page, he had written one final note, *Vera. They will mistake your quiet nature for weakness. Let them. The loudest person in the room is often the most insecure. True strength is in the silence, in the listening, in the plan. I am so proud of you. A tear finally fell, not of grief, but of gratitude. I didn't destroy a family. I just exposed the rot that was already there. I stopped propping up a structure that was designed to crush me, and in the quiet that followed its collapse, I found my own foundation. I found my peace. Have you ever had to stay quiet just to let someone show you exactly who they are? Tell me your story in the comments. I read all of them.